I'm Andy Smiley, the Friendly Podcast Guide. Every week, I put out an episode about a specific podcast to help you figure out if it's your next favorite podcast. Those come out on Tuesdays. I also put out another episode each Thursday that's a little more personal, either a list of podcasts I like for the season we're in, how I'm using podcasts in my own life, or something like that. This is one of those episodes, and this week it's all about parenting and motherhood. I'm super excited about this episode because I get to include tips and tricks from podcast hosts and some of you, my listeners. A couple weeks ago, I put out a request on Instagram for people to send in their parenting tips, and y'all didn't disappoint. So in this episode, I'm going to share 3 podcasts about motherhood and parenting, and then I'm going to sprinkle in tips and tricks from all of you. We're going to start with some advice from Whitney, the host of the How She Moms podcast. I talked about one of her fabulous episodes about teaching your kids to clean last week, so you should definitely go back and listen if you didn't hear about all of the episodes that can help you with your spring cleaning and organizing needs. When I asked Whitney for her favorite piece of parenting advice, this was the first one she gave me. Don't be overly concerned about potty humor. Consider it their first step toward gaining a sense of humor. Then laugh when it's funny and don't when it's not, so they start to get a feel for what works. We are just entering this potty humor phase with my 5-year-old, and I'm definitely trying to implement this advice. If you're looking for doable ways to improve your motherhood, I highly recommend 3 and 30 Takeaways for Moms. Rachel, the host, keeps each episode around 30 minutes, but packs them full of good information with clear takeaways that you can implement into your life immediately. This podcast introduced me to Quiet Time, and I am forever in debt to Rachel because of it. Quiet Time made my life much more manageable as a mom. When I got to chat with Rachel about her show on the Friendly Podcast Guide, she gave some fun behind the scenes on how 3 and 30 came to be and gave a really good description of the vibe of her show. I recommend listening to that episode to figure out if it's a good fit for you. Okay, the next piece of advice I got is from Sarah Stamps, one of my fabulous aunts and followers of the Friendly Podcast Guide. She's a veteran mom of 5, and she said, "Be a good listener and let them know you understand and see them." I love how simple this advice is, but I know from experience that implementing it is a bit harder. Luckily, we can apologize and try again when we aren't good listeners to our kids. Before I tell you about more parenting podcasts and tips, we're going to take a quick break to talk about my main tip for parenting, and that is kid podcasts. One of my favorite parenting tools is kid podcasts. I use them when I'm running errands with the kiddos to keep them from complaining the whole time, or when I need a mom break, I'll just grab an easy activity like coloring pages or a sensory bin, turn on a kid podcast, and the kids will be entertained for at least half an hour. I know that kid podcasts would help you in your life too, which is why I made a guide to kid podcasts. There are 8 categories ranging from science to mindfulness to audio drama, with at least 3 podcasts in each category. There are 27 podcasts in total on the guide. I've listened to each of the podcasts, so I can attest to them being kid-friendly. And I put my email at the bottom of the guide so that if you try a couple with your kids and none of them are a good fit, you can email me and I will personally help you find a kid podcast that works for your littles and you. You can grab this guide at the link in the show notes. One part of parenting that doesn't get talked about very much is miscarriage, stillbirth, and pregnancy after loss. Smooth Stones is a podcast for people struggling with any of these parts of parenthood. Amy Watson, the host, is a certified life coach, and she describes herself as a mom who has walked through stillbirth, miscarriage, and pregnancy after loss, who shares her tools, knowledge, and experience to show you how you can truly find yourself again after loss. On the episode Amy did on the Friendly Podcast Guide, she talks about some specific episodes people can listen to for different stages of their grief, and gives us a feel for what the show is like. You should definitely listen to that episode if you're wondering if this show will be one for you to try. Mina Molsa, one of my friends from Finland, is a nanny, so she has a unique take on taking care of kids and parenthood. I'm excited to add her advice to this episode. She said, "Don't be afraid to seek outside help. Be kind to yourself. Children mirror their caregivers. And remember that tomorrow is always a new day." I'm planning on writing this all down and taping it to my wall. I need all of these reminders daily. So earlier this week, I released my interview with Alexis and Alan Tanner, the hosts of the Parenting in Real Life podcast. This podcast is for people that would like to get tips about parenting, but also commiserate in the fact that parenting is one of the hardest things we've ever done, if not the hardest. In that episode earlier this week where I got to chat with Alan and Alexis, they talked about their struggle in parenthood being the biggest reason they decided to start the podcast, and they give a great description of the vibe of their show. I recommend listening to that episode to get to know the Tanners a little bit better and to make sure their podcast is what you're looking for. One of my new favorite people on the internet is Alex Fales, the host of the Mindful with Media podcast, a show that helps moms be more intentional about their use of technology. She gave some great advice about screen use for both us and our kids. When it's time to turn off a show, give your kids 2 options for what to do after. Also, when you're on your phone, narrate out loud what you're doing when you're with your toddler. These are both simple things that I'm going to implement into my day to help my family have a better relationship with screens. 2 weeks ago, in the episode about uplifting podcasts, I talked about the Mommying While Muslim podcast, but I would be remiss if I also didn't at least mention their podcast here. Their podcast and community is a great place for moms to find answers and feel less alone. Okay, we're ending with the piece of advice that is pretty specific, but is super applicable to me. So I have to share it. It's from Jen Tate, the host of the This Is Going to Be Fun podcast, a show that helps parents enjoy their teens instead of just surviving the teen years. She says, have your kids make their own lunches when they start kindergarten. They think it's super fun and it sets them up for not expecting you to do it. This is such a game changer. My kindergartner just does half day, so we didn't have to worry about packing lunches, but you better believe I will be starting this next fall when he goes to first grade. Thank you so much to everyone who submitted parenting tips. I had so many that I couldn't fit them all in this episode, but don't worry, I'm saving them for another episode I have planned in a couple of months. Also, if you want to try kid podcasts in your family, but you're not sure where to start, grab my kid podcast guide to find a kid podcast that's a good fit for your littles and you. Talk to you soon.